Why does the world so often misunderstand groups that choose to live differently? Throughout history, whenever a community adopts values, habits, or structures that challenge the dominant culture, misunderstanding follows naturally. The Seventh-day Adventist community is one such example. Much of what people think they know is shaped not by direct experience, but by assumptions, incomplete information, or labels passed down without context. To understand why misunderstanding exists, we must first understand how perception works, how societies interpret difference, and why nonconformity is frequently mistaken for extremism or isolation. Human beings tend to simplify complex realities. This is a basic psychological function that helps us navigate a fast-moving world. When we encounter a group that does not fit easily into familiar categories, the mind looks for shortcuts. These shortcuts often become stereotypes. Over time, stereotypes replace curiosity. Instead of asking why a group behaves in a certain way, people assume they already know. This is where misunderstanding begins, not with hostility, but with oversimplification. Another major factor is visibility without explanation. Many people notice surface-level practices, schedules, or lifestyle choices, but rarely hear the reasoning behind them. When behavior is seen without context, it is easy to misinterpret intent. Sociological studies consistently show that when a community's internal logic is not explained in neutral, educational terms, outsiders fill in the gaps with speculation. This does not happen because people are malicious, but because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. The mind prefers a quick explanation, even if it is inaccurate, over unanswered questions. There is also the issue of cultural contrast. Modern society often prioritizes speed, constant availability, and material success. Communities that emphasize structure, restraint, or long-term thinking can appear out of step with mainstream culture. When a group does not mirror popular trends, it is often labeled as rigid or outdated. Yet difference does not automatically mean opposition. Sometimes it simply reflects a different set of priorities. Without recognizing this distinction, observers mistake intentional living for rejection of society itself. Media representation plays a powerful role as well. Narratives are rarely neutral. Stories are shaped to be engaging, dramatic, or simplified for quick consumption. When coverage focuses on extremes rather than everyday realities, it distorts understanding. Most communities are made up of ordinary people balancing work, education, family, and personal growth. But ordinary stories do not attract attention. As a result, public perception is often formed around exceptions rather than norms. This creates a gap between reality and reputation. Another source of misunderstanding lies in the assumption that unity means uniformity. From the outside, structured communities are often perceived as monolithic, as if everyone thinks, acts, and lives the same way. In reality, diversity of thought, profession, personality, and background exists within every organized group. When outsiders fail to see this internal diversity, they project a single identity onto millions of individuals. This erases nuance and reinforces misunderstanding. Education also plays a role, both its presence and absence. When people are not taught how to analyze belief systems, lifestyles, or social movements objectively, they rely on emotional reactions rather than critical thinking. Education encourages questions such as, what historical factors shaped this group? What problems were they responding to? How do their practices function in daily life? Without these questions, misunderstanding thrives. With them, clarity begins to emerge. Another important element is fear of difference. Difference challenges comfort. When a group demonstrates that it is possible to live with alternative rhythms, values, or priorities, it implicitly questions the idea that the dominant way of living is the only or best way. This can trigger defensiveness. Rather than reflecting on their own choices, people may dismiss the alternative as strange or unnecessary. In this way, misunderstanding becomes a form of self-protection. Misunderstanding is also reinforced when dialogue is replaced by distance. When people do not interact personally, assumptions remain untested. Studies in social psychology show that direct interaction reduces prejudice far more effectively than information alone. When individuals meet real people rather than ideas about people, stereotypes weaken. The problem is not difference itself, but separation. Distance allows imagination to replace reality. It is also worth noting that discipline is often misread as control. When a community values structure, consistency, and self-regulation, outsiders sometimes interpret this as restriction rather than intentional choice. In many areas of life, education, athletics, or professional excellence, discipline is celebrated. Yet when discipline is applied to lifestyle or values, it is sometimes viewed suspiciously. This double standard contributes to misunderstanding. Time plays a role too. Communities with long histories are often judged by modern standards without historical context. Practices that made sense in one era are sometimes misunderstood when viewed through the lens of another. Without understanding the problems a community originally sought to solve, its continued traditions can appear arbitrary. Context restores logic. Without it, continuity looks like stubbornness rather than commitment. The truth is that misunderstanding often says more about how societies process difference than about the groups being misunderstood. It reveals a tendency to judge before understanding, to label before listening. When curiosity is replaced by conclusion, truth becomes harder to see. Yet education has the power to reverse this pattern. When people learn to ask better questions, they form better opinions. Understanding does not require agreement. One does not need to adopt a lifestyle to respect it. Education teaches us to distinguish between comprehension and endorsement. When this distinction is lost, dialogue shuts down. When it is restored, coexistence becomes possible. Misunderstanding fades not because everyone thinks the same, but because people learn to think more clearly. In a rapidly changing world, groups that maintain consistency can appear unusual. But consistency itself is not a flaw. It is often the result of deliberate choice, tested values, and long-term vision. When people slow down long enough to examine the reasons behind difference, they often discover logic where they expected rigidity, and intentionality where they expected isolation. The world does not misunderstand because the truth is hidden. It misunderstands because it often looks quickly instead of deeply. The truth is revealed not through argument, but through understanding. When education replaces assumption, clarity replaces confusion. And when clarity grows, respect follows naturally. In the end, misunderstanding is not permanent. It dissolves wherever learning is valued, dialogue is welcomed, and difference is explored rather than feared. The moment people choose to understand before judging, the truth no longer needs to defend itself. It simply becomes visible. Stereotypes form because the human mind is designed to simplify a complex world. Every day, people encounter more information than they can fully process, so the brain looks for patterns and shortcuts to make sense of reality quickly. These shortcuts are not created out of malice, they are created out of efficiency. When people encounter a group, idea, or behavior they do not fully understand. The mind fills in gaps using limited examples, second-hand stories, or cultural cues. Over time, these simplified impressions harden into generalizations, and generalizations become stereotypes. One of the strongest forces behind stereotype formation is repetition. When the same narrow image or narrative is repeated through conversation, media, or social environments, it begins to feel true simply because it is familiar. The brain often confuses familiarity with accuracy. If people repeatedly hear a certain description of a group, even without evidence, that description becomes the default lens through which new information is interpreted. This is known as confirmation bias, where individuals unconsciously seek information that supports what they already believe and ignore information that challenges it. Another reason stereotypes persist is lack of direct experience. When people do not personally interact with a group, they rely on indirect sources for understanding. These sources are often incomplete or exaggerated because extreme stories are more memorable and emotionally engaging than ordinary ones. As a result, the most visible examples come to represent the whole. Ordinary realities are overshadowed by unusual cases, creating a distorted image that feels representative but is not. Social identity also plays a role. People naturally divide the world into us and them as a way of understanding belonging. This mental division can unintentionally exaggerate differences and minimize similarities. When a group is seen as other, its behaviors are interpreted differently than the same behaviors within one's own group. Actions that are viewed as normal or disciplined internally may be seen as strange or rigid externally. This double standard reinforces stereotypes and makes them emotionally resistant to change. Education gaps further strengthen stereotypes. Without tools for critical thinking, people accept surface-level explanations instead of seeking deeper context. Historical background, social conditions, and internal diversity are rarely considered. When education focuses on memorization rather than analysis, stereotypes thrive because they are easy answers to complex questions. True understanding requires effort, and many people default to the simplest explanation available. Emotional comfort also sustains stereotypes. Challenging a stereotype often requires admitting that previous assumptions were incomplete or wrong. This can feel uncomfortable, especially when those assumptions are tied to identity or group belonging. It is often easier to protect existing beliefs than to revise them. As a result, stereotypes persist not because they are accurate, but because they feel stable and familiar. Time strengthens stereotypes when they are passed from one generation to the next without re-evaluation. What may have originated from a specific historical moment becomes detached from its original context and treated as timeless truth. Without periodic reflection and updated understanding, outdated perceptions remain active long after conditions have changed. This is how stereotypes outlive the realities that created them. Stereotypes also persist because they simplify social interaction. It takes effort to see individuals rather than categories. Categorization reduces mental load, but it also reduces accuracy. When people are busy or under stress, they are more likely to rely on stereotypes rather than curiosity. Over time, this habit becomes automatic unless consciously challenged. Breaking stereotypes requires exposure, education, and dialogue. When people encounter real individuals rather than abstract labels, assumptions weaken. Personal interaction introduces nuance that stereotypes cannot survive. Learning to ask questions instead of drawing conclusions shifts understanding from assumption to insight. This process does not happen instantly, but it is effective. Understanding how stereotypes form does not excuse them, but it explains why they are common and persistent. It reveals that misunderstanding is often a cognitive habit rather than a moral failure. When people become aware of how their perceptions are shaped, they gain the ability to correct them. Awareness creates choice. Stereotypes lose power when curiosity replaces assumption and education replaces repetition. The more people understand the mechanisms behind their own thinking, the less controlled they are by simplified narratives. In this way, understanding stereotypes is not just about understanding others, but about understanding how the human mind works. When that understanding grows, clarity replaces confusion, and long-held misconceptions finally begin to dissolve. Education and context play a central role in how people understand different communities because understanding is not automatic, it is learned. Without education, people rely on impressions. Without context, they rely on assumptions. Education teaches how to think, not what to think. It provides tools for analysis, comparison, and interpretation. When these tools are missing, the mind defaults to surface-level judgments. Communities that operate with distinct values, structures, or histories are especially vulnerable to misunderstanding when observers lack the educational framework to interpret difference accurately. Context is what gives meaning to behavior. The same action can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on the lens through which it is viewed. Without context, behavior appears random, extreme, or unnecessary. With context, it becomes logical and often purposeful. Education helps people ask essential questions. Where did this community come from? What challenges shaped its practices? What problems were they trying to solve? These questions move understanding away from opinion and toward insight. When context is ignored, practices are judged in isolation, stripped of the circumstances that gave them meaning. Historical context is especially important. Many communities are shaped by specific moments in time, social instability, economic hardship, cultural conflict, or rapid change. Practices that emerged as solutions in one era can seem unusual when viewed through a modern lens. Education reconnects present behavior to past conditions, revealing continuity rather than stubbornness. Without this perspective, long-standing traditions are misread as resistance to progress instead of intentional preservation of identity. Cultural context also matters. Every society normalizes certain behaviors while questioning others. What feels ordinary in one culture can feel strange in another. Education exposes this relativity. It teaches that normal is not universal, but culturally constructed. When people recognize this, they become less likely to judge difference as wrong and more likely to see it as alternative. This shift alone reduces misunderstanding significantly. It replaces comparison with comprehension. Another critical aspect is internal diversity. Outsiders often view communities as uniform because they lack detailed knowledge. Education reveals complexity. Within any organized group exist variations in opinion, lifestyle, profession, and interpretation. Understanding this internal diversity breaks the illusion of a single narrative. Without education, people collapse complexity into simplicity, creating inaccurate generalizations that persist over time. Education also challenges emotional reasoning. Many misunderstandings are driven not by facts, but by feelings, fear of the unfamiliar, discomfort with difference, or loyalty to one's own group. Education introduces critical thinking, which separates emotion from analysis. It encourages people to evaluate evidence, question sources, and recognize bias. This process does not remove emotion, but it prevents emotion from dominating interpretation. Context further explains why communities communicate the way they do. Language, symbols, and priorities are shaped by internal experience. When outsiders interpret these elements through their own frameworks, miscommunication occurs. Education bridges this gap by teaching people how to interpret meaning within the appropriate frame rather than projecting their own assumptions onto others. Another important role of education is distinguishing between understanding and agreement. Many people resist learning about different communities because they assume understanding requires endorsement. Education clarifies that comprehension is not compromise. One can understand a system, belief, or lifestyle without adopting it. This realization opens the door to dialogue. When people no longer feel threatened by understanding, curiosity replaces defensiveness. Media literacy is also part of this educational role. Much public understanding of communities comes from selective narratives. Education teaches people to question representation, recognize exaggeration, and seek multiple perspectives. Without this skill, media portrayals become substitutes for reality. With it, individuals learn to differentiate between storytelling and lived experience. Context also humanizes. When people understand the daily realities, challenges, and motivations of a community, abstraction disappears. Groups stop being ideas and start being people. This humanization is one of the most powerful effects of education. It reduces distance and increases empathy without requiring agreement. Ultimately, education and context do not eliminate difference, but they make difference intelligible. They transform confusion into clarity and suspicion into understanding. Misunderstanding thrives where knowledge is shallow and context is absent. Understanding grows where learning is intentional and perspective is expanded. When education teaches people how to place behavior within its proper context, communities stop appearing mysterious or extreme. They become understandable systems shaped by history, culture, and choice. This does not demand admiration or adoption. It demands accuracy, and accuracy is the foundation of respect. In a world of increasing diversity, education and context are no longer optional. They are essential. They allow people to coexist intelligently rather than react emotionally. When these tools are applied, misunderstanding loses its grip, and truth no longer needs to be defended. It can simply be seen. Difference is often mistaken for division because the human mind is more comfortable with familiarity than with contrast. When people encounter views, lifestyles, or systems that do not match their own, the brain quickly categorizes them as separate. This separation is not always intentional or hostile. It is a cognitive shortcut. Difference disrupts predictability, and predictability provides a sense of control. When something challenges what feels normal, it can trigger discomfort, and that discomfort is frequently misinterpreted as threat. Instead of seeing difference as variation within a shared human experience, it is framed as opposition. One reason this confusion persists is that societies often equate unity with sameness. From an early age, people are taught that agreement creates harmony and disagreement creates conflict. While shared values can strengthen cooperation, complete sameness is neither realistic nor necessary for unity. In complex systems such as societies, diversity of thought and practice actually increases resilience. However, when people lack education in systems thinking, they assume that difference weakens cohesion rather than strengthens it. This leads to the false belief that variation automatically creates fracture. Communication gaps intensify this misunderstanding. When groups do not explain the reasoning behind their differences, outsiders interpret silence as secrecy or refusal to engage. At the same time, outsiders may not ask questions because they assume difference implies rejection. This mutual hesitation creates distance. Over time, distance hardens into narrative. Without dialogue, imagination fills the gap, and imagination often leans towards suspicion rather than generosity. Difference becomes framed as deliberate separation instead of simple distinction. Another contributing factor is identity attachment. People often tie their sense of self to certain beliefs, routines, or cultural norms. When others live differently, it can feel like a challenge to one's own choices. Rather than reflecting on this discomfort, the mind externalizes it. Difference is labeled as wrong, dangerous, or divisive. This protects identity but distorts understanding. In reality, another person's way of living does not invalidate one's own, but emotional reasoning can blur this distinction. Historical patterns also reinforce this confusion. Throughout history, groups that stood apart from dominant norms were often treated with suspicion. Over time, societies learned to associate difference with instability. These inherited narratives continue to influence perception even when conditions have changed. Without conscious re-examination, people apply outdated assumptions to modern contexts. What once may have been a genuine source of conflict is now simply an alternative expression of values, yet it is still treated as division. Media representation plays a role as well. Differences are often highlighted only when they appear controversial or extreme. Ordinary cooperation, shared concerns, and overlapping values receive less attention because they are less dramatic. As a result, difference is portrayed through moments of tension rather than everyday reality. This skews perception. When people repeatedly see difference framed as conflict, they internalize the idea that division is inevitable whenever views diverge. Education helps clarify this confusion by teaching the difference between disagreement and disconnection. Disagreement exists within healthy relationships, organizations, and societies. Division occurs when communication breaks down and mutual recognition disappears. Difference alone does not cause division. The absence of understanding does. When people learn to analyze ideas rather than react emotionally, they become capable of engaging with difference without feeling threatened. Another overlooked factor is pace. Modern life moves quickly, leaving little time for nuance. People make judgments based on limited exposure because slowing down to understand feels inefficient, yet understanding requires time. When speed replaces reflection, labels replace learning. Difference is judged before it is explored. Over time, these quick judgments accumulate into rigid beliefs that feel true simply because they have not been questioned. Difference is also mistaken for division when people assume that alternative choices imply criticism of mainstream ones. This assumption creates defensiveness. In reality, most differences arise from context, experience, or priority rather than opposition. People adapt their lives to what they value or what they have learned works for them. Recognizing this reduces unnecessary tension. It allows people to coexist without needing to convince or convert one another. Understanding the distinction between difference and division changes how people relate. It replaces fear with curiosity and reaction with reflection. When difference is approached as information rather than threat, dialogue becomes possible. Mutual respect grows not from agreement, but from accurate perception. Difference does not fracture society. Misinterpretation does. When people learn to see diversity as variation within a shared human framework, division loses its power. Unity becomes flexible rather than fragile. It no longer depends on sameness, but on the ability to understand without needing to assimilate. In the end, difference is inevitable in any growing, thinking society. Division is not. Division is a choice reinforced by misunderstanding. When education, dialogue, and context are applied, difference becomes a source of insight rather than conflict. It stops being something to fear and starts being something to learn from.